The oppressive humidity of Guadalcanal clung to the night of August 21st, 1942, a palpable weight. The jungle thrummed with a symphony of insects, the ceaseless murmur of the Lunga River, and the coiled apprehension of men in hushed anticipation. U.S. Marines, entrenched in meager dugouts along the eastern sandbar bordering the river's mouth, clutched their rifles, their gazes fixed on the impenetrable blackness. They had been warned of an impending assault, yet few envisioned the Japanese launching themselves across open terrain in such overwhelming numbers. Nevertheless, as the hours crept past midnight, the stillness was shattered by guttural cries, the vanguard of Japanese infantry commencing a banzai charge. Their boots churned the mud, and the tips of their rifles, adorned with lengthy steel bayonets, glinted faintly under the starlight. The American response was immediate and fierce. Muzzle flashes erupted, spitting orange tongues of flame across the sandbar, while the steady roar of M1917 Browning machine guns punctuated the river's drone. Grenades detonated, hurling earth and bodies skyward. Still, the Japanese pressed on, a relentless tide. Their bayonets, leveled like lances, advanced. Some fell screaming into the shallows, felled mid-stride. Others breached the marine lines, leaping into foxholes with savage yells, their Type 30 bayonets, more akin to swords in their reach, slashing. Amidst the chaos of smoke and bloodshed, close-quarters combat devolved into a brutal melee. Shouts and curses mingled with the shriek of steel on steel. Though trained for such an eventuality, the Marines had never truly anticipated its ferocity. The M1 Garand, substantial and dependable, discharged with a sharp, decisive crack that sliced through the darkness, a stark contrast to the bolt-action Arasaka rifles favored by the Japanese. Its ability to fire repeatedly without the laborious process of reloading offered a distinct advantage. However, as the enemy drew perilously near, the Marines reverted to a more primal instinct. With swift, decisive movements, they affixed their own bayonets. These blades, shorter and broader, designed for the thrust, lent the Garand a new, menacing profile. Then came the order, sharp and clear above the pandemonium. "Forward! Drive them out!" As dawn broke, the battlefield revealed its grim truth. A charnel house. Bodies lay scattered across the sandbar, many disfigured by bullets, others contorted in the final moments of a desperate charge. Approximately 800 soldiers from Colonel Ichiki's detachment had advanced into that killing ground. Fewer than 100 would survive. The Marines, weary and grim, emerged from their positions, their bayonets slick with mud and gore, the ordeal etched onto their faces. For the first time in the Pacific Theater, the veneer of Japanese invincibility had been shattered. The Americans had not only repelled the assault, but had counterattacked with cold steel, sending survivors reeling in disbelief. For the Japanese, this was a profound revelation. Their military ethos was deeply rooted in the code of Bushido, a conviction that close combat with the bayonet represented the ultimate test of a soldier's valor. From their initial training, Japanese infantry were rigorously drilled in jukendo, the martial art of bayonet fighting. They were indoctrinated with the belief that Americans, coddled by comfort, would falter before a bayonet charge, that they would break and cower. Yet here on the dark sands of Guadalcanal, they encountered men who not only stood their ground, but surged forward, wielding their own blades. Silent and unyielding, eyewitnesses recounted the profound terror that gripped the Japanese soldiers when the American countercharge commenced. Marines, Garands slung low, advanced with fixed bayonets, their faces resolute, their eyes unwavering. Survivors would later confess that the sight of Americans, after decimating their comrades with superior rifle fire, wielding bayonets, was an experience they were utterly unprepared for. One Japanese soldier, writing years later, described it as being pursued by demons armed with inexhaustible ammunition, who then descended upon them with knives. In that moment, fear transitioned from an abstract concept to a visceral reality. The bayonet ceased to be a symbol of Japanese pride and transformed into an emblem of American ferocity. The battle left an indelible mark on the Marines as well. They had engaged in hand-to-hand combat in the suffocating darkness, hearing the savage cries of men who embraced death in service to their emperor as glorious. They had felt bayonets scrape against helmets, pierce rib cages, and clash against their own steel. They had witnessed comrades fall into the mud, only to be avenged in an instant of primal violence. But with the arrival of dawn, they saw something else. The Japanese dead, piled high, their myth shattered, their aura of unconquerable spirit broken by American steel and unyielding will. The larger conflict had only just begun. However, in those formative weeks on Guadalcanal, the United States gleaned a crucial insight into its adversary. Fanaticism could be confronted and overcome, and fear was not an exclusively American burden. The Japanese, in turn, learned a truth they struggled to reconcile. The bayonet, their proud symbol of martial superiority, could be turned against them, its mystique stripped away by men who neither romanticized it nor hesitated to use it when necessity dictated, and use it effectively. The M1 bayonet itself was unpretentious in appearance, little more than 10 inches of sharpened steel affixed to the Garand's barrel. It lacked the ceremonial length of its Japanese counterpart, devoid of the aura associated with a samurai's ancestral weapon. But its presence conveyed something deeper: the efficiency of an industrialized nation, the cold pragmatism of a military determined not to be outmatched. On Guadalcanal, its deployment signaled a fundamental shift. For every Japanese soldier who had envisioned an American recoiling from cold steel, the reality was burned into their collective memory. The Americans advanced, their rifles barking, their blades flashing. The Battle of the Tanaru was more than a tactical triumph, it was a psychological watershed. Colonel Ichiki's force had been tasked with annihilating the Marines, driving them into the sea. Instead, they were decimated, and within their annihilation lay the seeds of whispers that would spread through Japanese ranks in the ensuing months. The Americans were not only resilient and stubborn, but willing to engage in close-quarters combat with bayonets, exhibiting a ferocity the Japanese had believed was uniquely theirs. This notion was as terrifying as the steel itself. As the sun climbed higher over Guadalcanal that morning, Marines, weary, trudged across the sandbar, collecting discarded weapons and searching for any enemy wounded who might still be alive. The air was thick with the acrid scent of cordite and blood. Some Marines muttered curses, while others walked in somber silence, still reeling from the visceral intimacy of the violence. A few, with a grim curiosity, dislodged the long Type 30 bayonets from enemy rifles, holding them aloft and comparing them to their own. The Japanese blade was longer and more slender, designed for slashing and sweeping motions. The American bayonet, conversely, was shorter and broader, intended for a rapid, decisive thrust. The distinction extended beyond mere design. It represented a fundamental difference in philosophy. One was steeped in tradition, the other in pure practicality. On that field of carnage, practicality had emerged victorious, leaving Japanese survivors to limp back into the jungle, forever haunted by the memory of that charge. They had advanced with an unshakable confidence in their own superiority, only to return with hollow eyes, haunted by the image of Marines driving at them with fixed bayonets, the impossible made undeniable. Their subsequent reports, relayed through the command structure, spoke of an adversary who had defied all expectations. In the darkness, in the mud, amidst the deafening roar of rifles and the glint of steel, the Americans had demonstrated an unwavering resolve, refusing to yield even at the very edge of the blade. The jungle eventually quieted in the days that followed, the silence broken only by the calls of birds and the distant rumble of artillery. Yet, for those who had stood on that sandbar, an internal storm raged. Both Japanese and American soldiers carried the memory forward. The night assault, the sharp crack of the Garand, the sudden onslaught of bayonets. It was more than a mere clash of weaponry. It was the birth of a new, profound fear, And in the vast expanse of the Pacific, fear was as lethal a weapon as any bullet. Long before the conflict reached Guadalcanal, the bayonet held a significance far beyond its practical application for the Japanese soldier. It was an extension of their very identity. In barracks across the empire, recruits dedicated hours each day to rigorous bayonet drills with the Type 30 Arisaka rifle, their bayonets fixed, stabbing straw targets until their shoulders burned with exertion. The weapon was considerably longer than most Western counterparts, its blade extending to nearly 16 inches, effectively transforming the rifle into a formidable spear. Each thrust was accompanied by a guttural cry, a command from the instructor that resonated with more than mere discipline. It was an embodiment of Bushido, the warrior's path made manifest in steel. Soldiers were taught that their courage was not measured by their marksmanship, but by the steadfastness of their spirit when faced with the moment to meet an enemy's gaze and drive the blade home. To the Japanese infantrymen, the bayonet was irrefutable proof of their inherent superiority, a symbol of the empire's unyielding resolve against what they perceived as weaker, more effeminate adversaries. American training, however, presented a starkly different narrative. At training grounds like Paris Island or Camp Pendleton, Marines also engaged in bayonet drills, but the emphasis was never on ritualistic performance. For them, the blade was a utilitarian tool, a grim necessity. Their instructors emphasized efficiency. Aim low, thrust for the torso, finish the fight quickly. There was no poetic grandeur attached to the Garands bayonet. Its sole purpose was survival, its application purely practical. The Garand itself was the central component, a rifle capable of expelling 8 rounds of .30-06 caliber ammunition faster than any Japanese bolt-action rifle. The bayonet served merely as an extension of its firepower, intended to close the final gap when ammunition was depleted or the enemy drew too near. Where the Japanese viewed the bayonet as the embodiment of the soldier's spirit, Americans treated it as just another piece of equipment, no different in essence from a shovel or a canteen, save for its more deadly consequences. Yet, cultural perspectives created a profound divide. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese propaganda films depicted endless formations of soldiers executing bayonet drills in perfect synchronicity, their blades flashing brilliantly in the sun. Children in schools were educated to revere the bayonet charge as the zenith of bravery. Veterans of the Russo-Japanese War recounted tales of steel clashing against steel on the Manchurian plains, stories so frequently retold that myth hardened into doctrine. By 1941, when Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, this belief was firmly entrenched. No American, raised on Hollywood films and hamburgers, could withstand the formidable will of a Japanese bayonet charge. Officers spoke of this conviction as an unassailable truth, asserting that the bayonet was not merely metal, but destiny itself. This deeply held belief collided head-on with stark pragmatism in the South Pacific. American after-action reports from early skirmishes consistently noted the almost ceremonial manner in which Japanese troops wielded their bayonets. They charged with fervent cries of "Tenno Heika Banzai, long live the Emperor," aiming to instill terror in their foes through the sheer force of their spiritual conviction. However, the Marines did not break. Their semi-automatic rifles barked with a rapidity that outpaced the Japanese soldiers' ability to close the distance, and when the gap narrowed to mere feet, the Americans did not falter. They lowered their own bayonets, shorter and more robust, designed not for slashing but for thrusting with brutal efficacy. What the Japanese regarded as sacred, the Americans employed with a disarming indifference, and this very indifference proved unsettling. Numerical data offers a partial perspective. Official Pacific Theater records indicate that fewer than 2% of combat-related deaths were attributable to bayonets. Bullets and artillery were responsible for the overwhelming majority of fatalities. Nevertheless, interviews conducted decades later reveal that soldiers recalled bayonet encounters with a clarity that often eclipsed even prolonged firefights. Why? Because the bayonet represented intimacy, a brutal closing of the space between men, forcing one human being to end another's life at an almost breath's distance. For the Japanese, this proximity was intended to be their advantage. For the Americans, it became irrefutable proof that they could master even the most primal of battlefield trials. Certain moments, whispered in the memoirs of veterans, exposed this profound psychological fracture. A Japanese conscript, recounting his experiences years after the war, described the first time he witnessed American Marines countercharging with bayonets fixed. "It was as though their rifles had become tusks," he wrote. "We had been told Americans were afraid of cold steel, but they came forward like beasts that did not feel fear." Another veteran recalled his own terror, not stemming from the length of the American blade, but from the unshakable resolve in the Marine's eyes, determined, expressionless, utterly unshaken by the proximity of the kill. What unnerved him was not merely the weapon itself, but the complete absence of hesitation. On the American side, accounts conveyed a distinctly different tone. Marines spoke of the surge of adrenaline that coursed through them when they fixed bayonets, of how their ingrained training instincts took over. Some admitted that it was in those moments they felt least human, as fear blurred into sheer violence. A few described a peculiar clarity that descended upon them as they witnessed Japanese soldiers falter in the face of their relentless charge. Men who had been taught that their courage was absolute, suddenly breaking and retreating. "They thought they had a monopoly on guts," one Marine later remarked. But the Garand spoke, and when it was empty, the bayonet spoke louder. His words encapsulated the core of the cultural confrontation. The Japanese had meticulously constructed an identity around their blade. The Americans, however, systematically dismantled its mystique, transforming it into a weapon of simple, unadorned terror. The deeper irony lay in the fact that the Japanese blade was longer, sharper, and arguably more refined. In a pure contest of steel, it should have possessed a distinct advantage. Yet, superiority in warfare rarely rests solely on the efficacy of the weapon, but on the unyielding will behind its deployment. The Japanese anticipated overwhelming force. The Americans delivered cold pragmatism, and when these two opposing forces collided, it was awe that shattered first. Survivors carried the indelible memory of those encounters long after the battles had ceased, speaking of how the Americans had appropriated their own symbol and turned it against them, reducing sacred ritual to mere mechanics. In the quiet contemplation of post-war reflection, many admitted that it was in those moments they truly grasped the vulnerability of their empire. The conflict had transcended the physical battlefield, infiltrating the very minds of the combatants. Each bayonet clash on islands like Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Bougainville progressively eroded the myth that had sustained Japanese morale. For men raised to believe that sheer spirit could triumph over overwhelming firepower, it was a devastating revelation, as cruel as it was undeniable. The Americans possessed superior firepower, undeniably, but they also wielded steel and an unwavering will to employ it without hesitation. The bayonet no longer belonged exclusively to Japan. It had been claimed by the very enemy they had so readily scorned. By 1943, Japanese officers began to take notice of this discernible shift. Reports emanating from the front lines spoke of American bayonet charges that successfully breached entrenched positions, and of Japanese soldiers increasingly reluctant to advance into the formidable Marine lines, bristling with Garands and fixed bayonets. The bayonet, once their emblem of dominance, was rapidly becoming a harbinger of dread, and the whispers grew. If even the blade could not guarantee victory, what bastion of spirit remained? What certainty could they still cling to? The answer hung heavy in the jungle air, unspoken yet damning. The September sun beat down with merciless intensity over Peleliu in 1944, baking the coral ridges into blinding white heat and transforming every movement into an agonizing ordeal. Marines advancing across this brutal landscape were not merely contending with enemy soldiers, but with the very island itself. Jagged coral tore at their boots, Heat radiated from the ground like a forge's inferno, and Japanese bullets snapped through the air, originating from unseen caves and fortified bunkers. For hours, the battle devolved into a relentless cycle of sporadic gunfire and suffocating silence, an unending progression of advance and halt, fire and crawl. The Japanese defenders, entrenched deep within honeycombed ridges, had long abandoned reckless charges. Now they lay in wait, concealed within the shadows, compelling the Americans into close, suffocating combat. It was here, amidst the treacherous coral and the acrid smoke of detonating grenades, that the bayonet resurfaced, not as a ritualistic weapon, but as a stark and immediate necessity. The Marines, slick with sweat and blood, understood that their rifles alone could not penetrate the Stygian darkness of a cave or the intricate twists of a tunnel. When grenades failed to dislodge the enemy, only one recourse remained: fix bayonets and advance. Survivors recalled the chilling moment before the charge, the metallic click of steel locking firmly onto the rifle barrel, the brief, ethereal gleam of the blade against the sunlight before it vanished into the oppressive gloom. Then came the charge, short, brutal, and decisive. Rifles discharged at point-blank range. Smoke choked the air as bayonets plunged into the darkness where figures lunged out, screaming. In that confined, vicious engagement, the weapon transcended its role as an auxiliary to firepower and became the decisive determinant between life and agonizing death. Japanese soldiers, who had once believed themselves masters of the blade, now confronted a terrifying reversal. Marines stormed their positions, their Garands already emptied of ammunition, their bayonets thrusting forward with cold, unyielding efficiency. The American blade was indeed shorter, but it was wielded with a determination that brooked no hesitation. A Japanese veteran, recounting his experience years later, confessed that the first time he witnessed Americans advancing into a cave with bayonets fixed, he felt as though the very earth had turned against him. "We had thought the bayonet was ours," he stated, "but they used it as though it had always belonged to them." This admission, whispered in the quiet retrospection of later years, illuminated the catastrophic collapse of an illusion that had sustained the Imperial Army for decades. On Peleliu, the ferocity of the fighting left no room for distance. Men met in spaces so confined that rifles became spears, the jarring clang of steel against bone echoing through tunnels rank with the stench of cordite and blood. Marines spoke of locking eyes in the suffocating gloom, of thrusts landing with a shocking, visceral intimacy, of bodies collapsing at their feet. It was combat that stripped away all pretense, reducing warfare to its most raw and primal human form. And it was here that the bayonet's psychological weight intensified. For the Americans, it became tangible proof that they could endure even this hellish crucible. For the Japanese, it represented the devastating realization that their adversaries had usurped the very weapon they had considered their exclusive domain. If Peleliu served as a crucible, then Okinawa in 1945 was an inferno. Here, on the Pacific's final Great Island campaign, the bayonet re-emerged in ways that seared themselves into collective memory. Okinawa was no swift engagement. It was a grueling, months-long attrition, with every hill and cave purchased with an ocean of blood. Rain transformed the landscape into sodden swamps, and artillery reduced the earth to a quagmire. Civilians, caught in the tragic confusion, crowded the battlefield. Amidst this pervasive chaos, close combat became an inevitable reality. Marines and soldiers pressed into labyrinthine networks of limestone caves where Japanese troops, desperate and unyielding, awaited them, and once again the bayonet spoke. Veterans of Okinawa recalled advancing into bunkers where the light vanished and the enemy lurked mere feet away. Garand fire thundered in bursts, followed by an unnerving silence, then the rasp of boots against stone as bayonets thrust forward. In some tunnels, there was barely enough room to properly wield a rifle. Men crawled with bayonets leading the way, each movement a perilous gamble between survival and instantaneous death. One Marine wrote that the darkness was populated by shapes more than actual men. Shadows lunging out of shadows, met by the sudden flash of steel and the grunt of impact. For the Japanese soldiers within those subterranean confines, men trained since their youth to view the bayonet as their ultimate advantage, the dawning realization was utterly devastating. The Americans were not afraid. They advanced regardless, their bayonets piercing not only flesh but also the deeply ingrained myth of their own invincibility. The human cost was staggering. At Okinawa, more than 12,000 Americans perished, and over 100,000 Japanese soldiers met their end, a significant number in close-quarters combat that stripped away any lingering illusion of distance. Yet, within these grim statistics lay countless unrecorded encounters where the bayonet served as the final arbiter. Marines remembered comrades lost to sudden, unexpected thrusts, but they also recalled the grim triumph of survival, the way their own bayonets drove the enemy back into the oppressive darkness. The Japanese remembered something else entirely, the profound horror of witnessing an enemy they had so readily dismissed as weak wield the blade with equal and at times even greater ferocity. A weapon once believed to embody the very spirit of Japan had become the stark hallmark of American relentless determination. For the Americans, these intense encounters solidified a reputation that was already beginning to form. The United States Marines, in particular, elevated the narratives of Peleliu and Okinawa into legendary status. They recounted tales of bayonet assaults that pulverized fortified positions and of fierce retaliatory strikes that shattered the enemy's final lines of defense. The bayonet transformed into an integral element of their folklore, not primarily as a frequently employed instrument of death, but as a potent emblem of unyielding resolve, signifying their readiness to confront the adversary on his chosen territory and still emerge victorious. This weapon was never depicted in an overly romanticized light, nor was it ever revered as an object of sacredness. Yet it was remembered as undeniable proof that no implement, however antiquated, could shield the Japanese from their impending defeat. In stark contrast, the Japanese people carried the recollection of the bayonet as something far more somber. Servicemen who had fought in the war admitted in interviews conducted after the conflict's conclusion that the American bayonet charges had profoundly unnerved them to a degree that machine guns or artillery had never achieved. These more conventional weapons were anticipated, but the bayonet was not expected to be in American hands. It was considered an exclusive weapon of the Empire. Witnessing it wielded against them felt akin to observing their own reflection turn against them in betrayal. One Japanese officer described it as a pilferer of bravery, siphoning not only lives but also the very bedrock of their perceived superiority. In the brutal island engagements, the bayonet transcended its material form as mere steel. It evolved into a catalyst for psychological inversion, a weapon that systematically dismantled deeply ingrained illusions. At Peleliu and Okinawa, the significance lay not in the sheer number of individuals felled by blades, but rather in the widespread erosion of morale caused by the mere sight of them. American Marines advancing with bayonets fixed, their countenances set with an unyielding determination, conveyed a message far more impactful than any spoken word. It signaled an unwavering American resolve. And as the Japanese witnessed this declaration of tenacity repeated time and again in visceral combat, their own convictions began to falter. Once the final reverberations of conflict had receded from Okinawa's dramatic cliffs, both sides bore wounds that would forever remain unhealed. For the American servicemen, the bayonet served as a poignant reminder of their survival, a testament to courage measured in mere inches of ground gained. For the Japanese, it represented a haunting symbol of their shattered certainties. The very blade they had once considered sacrosanct had been stripped of its mystical aura, and instead became irrefutable evidence of their own downfall, and as whispers of capitulation began to permeate the ruined landscapes of the Pacific, one undeniable truth persisted. The bayonet, in its stark simplicity and brutal efficiency, had evolved into a weapon that engaged the mind as much as it did the body. The war culminated in an inferno and ultimately surrender. However, the spectral remnants of clashing steel lingered long after the thunderous roar of artillery had fallen silent amidst the devastated remnants of Tokyo. Veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army were haunted by specters that refused to depart. For a great number, the bayonet represented the most piercing of these phantoms. It was not the katana of the samurai, the weapon they had been indoctrinated to venerate, but rather the more compact, merciless blade wielded by the Americans, which had relentlessly pursued them through dense jungles and subterranean caves. Correspondence penned years later bears witness to the profound shame that clung to these men. Their shame stemmed not only from their ultimate defeat, but from the dawning realization that the very emblem they had been taught embodied the essence of the Japanese spirit had been decisively mastered by their adversaries. The bayonet was intended to be the definitive weapon of courage. Instead, it had become the ultimate testament to their fear. American veterans, in contrast, recalled its presence with a blend of somber pride and a lingering sense of unease in veterans of foreign wars' halls decades later, particularly when discussions turned to Guadalcanal or Peleliu. While some recounted intense firefights or the overwhelming power of artillery barrages, it was the narratives of bayonet encounters that invariably cast a hush over the gatherings. Those moments when the enemy was so perilously close enough to discern their scent, to hear their very breath, close enough that survival hinged entirely on the swift, decisive thrust of steel. These accounts were never recounted with boastful bravado. Instead, they were shared with the solemnity of men who had directly confronted the war's most intimate forms of violence. One Marine, in a post-war interview, explained that bullets kill from a distance, but the bayonet teaches you the stark reality of death's proximity. That profound sense of nearness remained with them long after they had departed the ravaged battlefields. Statistical data could never adequately convey that visceral weight. Military records indicated that bayonet-inflicted wounds constituted a mere fraction of the overall casualties sustained in the Pacific theater. Artillery and small arms fire were responsible for the vast majority of combat deaths. Nevertheless, commanders on both sides consistently noted how frequently the bayonet was mentioned in after-action reports, and how often its mere presence had a decisive impact on troop morale. A Japanese officer penned a bitter lament in 1943, stating that his soldiers harbored a greater dread of the American bayonet than of their machine guns, a confession that carried its own profound sting of humiliation. The Americans, meanwhile, quietly integrated the bayonet into their emerging mythology. It was not presented as a common instrument of slaughter, but rather as a symbol of absolute refusal, of unyielding grit pressed to its very limits. This mythology permeated military training for decades after the war concluded. At Paris Island, recruits in the 1950s and 1960s continued to practice bayonet drills under the relentless, scorching sun. The resonant voices of their drill instructors echoed with the lingering memory of the Pacific campaigns. Each thrust was intended to impress upon them not merely the realities of combat, but the weight of history itself. It was a reminder that their predecessors had faced an enemy who fundamentally underestimated their capacity to wield steel and had proven that assumption spectacularly wrong. The bayonet ceased to be a mere tool. It transformed into a deeply ingrained lesson etched into the recruit's muscle memory. Never surrender, never hesitate, and never permit an opponent's deeply held beliefs to remain unchallenged. For the Japanese, the legacy associated with the bayonet was considerably more complex. In post-war Japan, it was remembered less as a symbol of pride and more as a stark relic of the aggressive militarism that had ultimately led their nation to ruin. Museums displayed the long Type 30 bayonets behind protective glass, positioned alongside faded uniforms and yellowed photographs. These were artifacts from an era when unwavering spirit was considered a more potent force than industrial might. The veterans who had once trained by the thousands with these very blades now walked past them in silent contemplation, acutely aware that their once sacred aura had been irrevocably diminished. Some would quietly confide in their families about the desperate night charges, the relentless American counterattacks, and the chilling manner in which the shorter blade of the M1 Garand seemed to pierce not only flesh but the very core of their convictions. For many, it was not the physical defeat that haunted them, but the profound psychological blow they had sustained. The irony of the situation became sharper with each retelling. Japan, a nation steeped in the warrior tradition of the samurai, had envisioned its soldiers as the rightful inheritors of the sword's noble spirit. Yet, it was American farmhands from Iowa, factory workers from Ohio, and fishermen from New England who had employed the bayonet to redefine the war's most intensely personal violence. The Americans had not sought glory in its use. They had pursued survival, and in that relentless pursuit, they had appropriated the weapon intended to embody Japanese martial supremacy and transformed it into an instrument of American resolve. This profound reversal resonated far more deeply than any strategic maneuver or statistical calculation. It fundamentally reshaped national identities. Survivors from both sides bore witness to this transformation in their own distinct ways. A Marine who fought on Okinawa recalled years later that upon observing Japanese soldiers falter and break at the sight of a bayonet charge, he grasped a truth that he was unable to articulate at the time, that deeply ingrained myths could crumble far more rapidly than human lives. A Japanese veteran, his voice trembling during an oral history interview conducted decades after the war's conclusion, confessed that he had not feared the bullet. It was an impersonal force, an inevitable consequence of war, but he had harbored a profound dread of the American soldier advancing with a bayonet. "It was not supposed to be theirs," he murmured softly. "When they wielded it, we understood that we were no longer unique." This poignant admission encapsulated the emotional truth of the Pacific conflict, a truth more piercing than any blade. By the time peace had been restored, the bayonet's historical standing had undergone a significant metamorphosis, shifting from its role as a battlefield weapon to that of a potent cultural symbol. For the Americans, it joined the esteemed pantheon of iconic war imagery. The distinctive ping of the M1 Garand, the iconic Marine helmet, and the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima all became integral components of their narrative of victory. For the Japanese, it lingered as a stark memento of shattered illusions and a pride that had been systematically dismantled by the relentless advance of their adversaries. The blade itself had undergone no physical alteration. Steel remained steel. However, the meaning imbued within it had been irrevocably transformed. What had once represented the embodiment of the Bushido spirit now stood as a stark symbol of its utter dissolution, a truth that persisted even decades later, as the battlefields of the Pacific gradually succumbed to the encroaching jungle growth and their once contested ridges lay silent and empty. Visitors exploring museums or traversing war cemeteries could sense the profound weight of this legacy. The bayonet displayed behind glass was not merely a piece of metal. It was memory, made tangible. It represented the chilling sound of soldiers fixing bayonets at dawn on Guadalcanal. It evoked the harrowing sight of Marines charging into the suffocating darkness of caves on Peleliu. It conjured the suffocating silence within Okinawa's tunnels, where unseen shadows confronted one another. It encapsulated fear and survival, pride and profound humiliation, victory and devastating loss, all precariously balanced on a single, sharpened edge. The enduring legacy of this blade was never about quantitative measures. It was fundamentally about perception, about the personal narratives that soldiers carried home and the profound truths they revealed in hushed whispers years later. The Japanese had held a firm conviction that the bayonet was their exclusive weapon. The Americans had demonstrated that it belonged to no one. In the crucible of war, symbols possess a power equal to that of physical weapons, and at times they are one and the same. The bayonet in the Pacific was precisely such a symbol, one that inflicted wounds far deeper than flesh, one that fundamentally reshaped how adversaries perceived themselves and each other. As history gradually receded into the realm of memory, the core lesson endured. Myths possess the capacity to sustain armies, but they also harbor the potential to betray them. Unquestioning belief and a misplaced sense of superiority can prove as perilous as any tangible enemy. And when steel met steel on the arduous ridges of Peleliu, in the treacherous mud of Okinawa, and upon the desolate sands of Guadalcanal, that critical lesson was indelibly written in the blood of those who fought. The Japanese infantrymen, who had once engaged in relentless drills with their bayonets, entered the conflict with an ingrained certainty of their impending dominance. They departed carrying the indelible memory of American soldiers who met them at the precipice and refused to yield. And within that enduring memory lay the quiet, yet devastatingly potent, truth. The blade, once held as sacred, had ultimately become the instrument of their undoing.